I call Ginny Andersen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for the opportunity, Mr Chair, to speak on the amendment to the Dairy Restructuring Act. And I think it's important that we look at the role that the dairy industry plays in New Zealand and also how this has changed over time. There was a time in New Zealand when any small farmer had the opportunity of participating in dairy farming and of being able to make a living from dairy farming. And over time, as we've seen companies grow bigger and a more corporate spread happening, while that's benefited New Zealand hugely, and we look at the contribution that our only multinational company, Fonterra, makes to our economy, we also look at how the average person trying to make a living in farming, their first crack really is as a share milker, not as an owner or an operator. And so when we look at the inability of the average farmer to be able to participate and own and take a stake in how this is happening, we need to make sure that there is sufficient competition within New Zealand's dairy industry to enable that healthy competition to take place. And so what we've seen through the Commerce Commission's inquiry is that this is not sufficient in the South Island, that there is not a sufficient level of competition happening in order for us to be satisfied that those provisions should expire. And that's exactly why this piece of legislation is being put through under urgency. We need to make sure that there is sufficient knowledge that we do have healthy competition, that we do have a good way of doing this. And the Labour Party has a strong record of making sure that we have healthy competition in the marketplace. When I think back to having telecom as a single provider in our telecommunications industry, we looked at, under the last Labour government, looked at opening up the marketplace for there to be more healthy competition and enable other providers to give New Zealanders access to fair price products in the telecommunications market. And that's also what we need to be reassuring New Zealanders that should be happening right here. And for that reason, we need to make sure that there is good opportunities for those in the South Island to have a fair go. Now, one of the things that I remember growing up in parts of rural New Zealand was seeing how much it's important to have a good community and good people who can make ends meet. And I remember clearly at A&P days where kids were struggling out in the farms and where farmers are struggling. We need to make sure that this bill proceeds with urgency in order to give that reassurance. The government wants to take a strategic view of the dairy industry, given its place in New Zealand's economy. 40% is a big whack of what we earn, and it's about right that we made sure we did it properly. I think the members opposite would be inclined to rush into this blindly and stamp it and not be too concerned. But we do need to remember that this bill did not proceed to select committee, and it does need further interrogation and debate at this point in time. And it would be nice if the members opposite actually even paid attention and started listening and contributing to the debate instead of sitting there quietly. So it's important that they don't even seem to be that concerned about this piece of legislation that was kicked off initially by their own party. But there's still opportunity. There's still opportunity tonight for further comment, and I encourage the members opposite to read the papers and take upon the debate and talk about some of their own constituents potentially who could benefit from this piece of legislation progressing as quickly as possible. So, Mr Chair, I thank you for the opportunity and I commend this bill to the House.
Madam Chair.